capable hands. So I'm sure Alex is going to save the day with brilliant technical work. And I'm very glad to introduce Warren Kovack. Before that, I have Charlie Parsons' book synopsis. The book is produced, so this is by way of an advertisement, and it is free. So do pick this up, as well as buying Warren's books, obviously. But this is free, and it will give you an idea of what's in Charlie's book. Warren Kovack, thank you so much for coming. Sort of Anglesey's leading historian. 4 books, well, what's on Wales? 3 books on Anglesey, including A to Z of Anglesey, Anglesey and 50 Buildings, and Anglesey Through Time. And tonight is going to talk to us about the Menai Suspension Bridge and its significance for Anglesey and what it's meant for the island, and I suppose for Wales and more broadly. So thank you very much for coming in, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much for asking me. This is a different style of talk of what I usually do for me. I give lots of talks about Anglesey history, and usually when I'm talking, I'll prowl around in front of the screen pointing at things. But here I'm sat next to Owen, and looking out at the audience here. But it sort of reminds me of the strange days of COVID, because I gave a lot of talks over Zoom at the time to a sort of a sea of disembodied and silent heads. So it's nice to see some real people here. So anyways, excuse me. Anyways, as you can probably tell from my accent by now, I'm not a native of Anglesey. I'm originally from Ohio in the USA, but I've been living in Britain for more than half my life. I was about 27, I think, when I moved over here. And I moved up to Anglesey in 1992. But anytime I've moved anywhere, I always like to learn about the history of places. And when I moved to Anglesey and set up a business selling software here, I decided to set up a little website with a little bit about the history of Anglesey. It started off as just 1 page talking about the history of Anglesey, and then expanded into 2, then eventually turned into this full Anglesey history website here. And you can see the address for it down there, angleseyhistory.co.uk. But if you search for Anglesey history, it's the top thing that always comes up, because it's a very popular site, gets hundreds of visitors a month. All sorts of things. There's a section about the Menai bridges, which I'm going to be talking about tonight, about the tower windmills, about churches, chapels, prehistoric monuments, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of things there, and also about a blog and other things there. On top of that, I was approached by a publisher called Amberley Publishing, a local history publisher, back in about 2012. They asked me to write a book about Anglesey history called Anglesey Through Time for one of the series that they did. And that came out in 2013. And since then, as Owen mentioned, I've had 2 other books come out, Anglesey and 50 Buildings and the A to Z of the Isle of Anglesey too. And my most recent one, I've expanded out a bit, so I'm going all over Wales now, and I've written a book about the lighthouses of Wales, and that just came out in November. So there's copies up here. I've got lots of copies, and I can sell copies to you if you want. But the other thing I've been interested in is the bridges. And in 2013, my interest in the bridges led me to become a trustee and volunteer for Menai Heritage, or the Menai Bridge Community Heritage Trust. And they run the Bridges Museum in Menai Bridge, in the old schoolhouse just across from Waitrose there. And I became a trustee and volunteer with them. And one of the things I did was, well, I've done all sorts of different things with the charity, but one of the things I did is I co-authored with Bob Damon, the chair of this short little walking guide to the Menai Strait Bridges. Just a few pages, where a book about the bridges and how you can take your own walk around it and see interesting things. And then a few years later, Bob sat down and wrote the full book about the Menai Suspension Bridge, Suspension Bridge in the first 200 years. And Bob was he was a very good friend of mine. He had been the director of highways for Gwynedd, and was a very good civil engineer, great enthusiast for the bridges and for the history of civil engineering, and Thomas Telford was his hero. And he always said anytime he read a book about the Menai Bridge that they always had things wrong. He says, I'm going to write a book that gets everything right. So he wrote this book. It's 200 pages long, very, very comprehensive, tells you everything you want to know about the Menai Suspension Bridge. And that was published in 2019. Sadly, Bob died just a few months after the book came out, but I was glad. I helped him out with this. I was doing the page layout and everything, so I was very glad to help him get this book out. But it's a definitive story about the Menai Bridge. And I've got copies of that too, if you're interested in them. But my talk today is going to be based a lot on Bob's research out of that book. So the first thing is, why build a bridge at all? The Anglesey is a very nice place to visit, obviously, but more important to that, it's the home of Holyhead, and Holyhead's been the packet port for ships going back and forth to Ireland ever since the times of Elizabeth I. She designated Holyhead as the packet port, so all the official communications, diplomats, business people, and all that going back and forth to Ireland be going through Holyhead. And of course, it's developed quite a lot over the years. And particularly became more important with the Act of Union in 1800. Ireland at that point became an integral part of the United Kingdom, so a lot more people were coming across the Anglesey to Holyhead to want to go over to Dublin. Before the bridges were built, the only way you could get across was to take a ferry, and there were several places along the strait where their ferries went back and forth all the way from out here at Menai near Carnarvon, and then all the way up towards Beaumaris as well. But the ferries obviously were inconvenient. They could be dangerous. If it was stormy weather, you got the tides wrong, you could be shipwrecked on a bank, and a lot of people drowned going across. So once the traffic got to the critical stage, wanting to go across Anglesey to Holyhead, they decided we really need to do something about not only building a bridge, but also improving the roads throughout North Wales. This painting here shows the view of what the Menai Strait looked like before the bridge was built. The bridge would have gone right across, it goes right across there now with one of its bases on that rock there. And you can see the ferries going across, and there's the ferry inn, or the Cambry Inn as it's called over there, and a little man with a trumpet here calling the ferries over. So a lot of ideas were then brought up to try to build a bridge. Ever since 1783 was the first serious look into what kind of bridge you could have across there. John Gilborn came up with a couple ideas. One was to build an embankment across the Swillies here. There's Church Island on Sicilio there, and then this is the Swillies that's between the two bridges. So he would have built a causeway. There are several rocks across there that you could put towers on and all that. So he thought about putting the causeway there with a drawbridge in it for the ships to get through. And he also came up with another idea of maybe going across here instead, and that's where the current Menai Suspension Bridge goes. That idea was looked at by William Jessup a couple of years later, and he thought that was the best idea too. But some people on Anglesey didn't like it. They wanted ferry crossings, or they wanted the bridge to be closer to some of the existing ferry crossings. So William Jessup was then confirmed that this would be the best site there. Joseph Nicholas came up with three alternative ideas for the bridge, which had been further east, closer to Beaumaris, in various places near where the Bangor Pier is today and so on. But all the interests of all the merchants in Carnarvon thought that would draw people away from Carnarvon and more towards Bangor if they built the bridge there. So they basically nixed that idea of building a bridge there. But once the Act of Union came along in 1800 and 1801, then they really decided they really need to resurrect the idea of building a bridge again. So John Rennie was hired then to come up with some ideas in 1802. He was commissioned by the Chief Secretary of Ireland to propose plans. And John Rennie at the time was one of the foremost civil engineers of the time. He pioneered the use of cast iron in bridges and buildings. He improved harbors, including a lot of work on Holyhead and in Dublin and so on. So he came up with a couple ideas, using those same two routes I showed you before. So this was a bridge that he would have built across the Swillies there. So you'd have had these towers built on these rocks here, and then arches between them, and then embankments leading up to it there. And then he also came up with another idea for a bridge where the existing Menai Suspension Bridge is here, with two towers on either side, and then an arch over that narrower bit of the bridge. He recommended the Swillies route as being the better one, but it also happened to be the more expensive one. He estimated that would have cost $290,000 compared to $259,000 for that one. But again, the interests of the merchants in Carnarvon defeated that idea too, so that didn't go anywhere. When Bob Damon was working on the book, a friend of his had been looking through John Rennie's papers up in the National Library of Scotland and found this, which was very intriguing. Nobody had really seen this before. And this is a drawing of another proposal of a bridge. And this would have been up near Beaumaris, just about where Bangor Pier is today. And this would have been a long embankment here with lots of arches. Most of them would be closed over except for a little space there. And then you'd have three arches there where the ships actually could go through. Nobody's quite sure who actually drew this and why and where, but again, that idea never came to fruition, of course, and it probably dates from about 1811 or so, given the context in which it was found. But it was interesting, another idea of where the bridge could be built. In 1810, then, this project was passed on to Thomas Telford, who was one of the foremost civil engineers of the time. This gives you, he was born in Dumfriesshire in 1757, and this tells you all the things he was working on. Pontcasilte Aqueduct, of course, is one of the most famous ones. He built huge amounts of stuff up in Scotland and the Highlands and so on, lots of other things too. But in 1810, then, he was appointed to survey the roads between Chester and Shrewsbury to Anglesey and then on to Holyhead, and suggest improvements, not only in building bridges across the strait, but also improving the roads in general. And he began improvement then. After his reports were accepted, then he began working on the improvement of the roads and planning the crossing of the Menai Strait. This is one of Telford's first ideas about a bridge to put across the Menai Strait. Again, this is going across the Swilly, so you got these rocks here. And he's got two towers on there, and then smaller arches between them and larger arches going over either side. I think it's quite an elegant bridge. I would love to have seen that actually built, but unfortunately it wasn't. And then he came up with this idea of a bridge where the current suspension bridge is. It would have been big abutments on either side and then a big iron arch going across like that. One problem with these ideas with having iron arches, though, is that at the time there were over 800 tall sailing ships that were going up and down the Menai Strait. And the Admiralty said any bridge you build across there has to be 100 feet high all the way across so our ships can get through. Now with an arch bridge, it may be 100 feet high in the middle, but on the side here, it's not. So if the ship goes off course a little bit, it's going to be in trouble. So arch bridges like this really couldn't be used to cross the Menai Strait. So Telford had to come up with another idea. What he came up then was the idea of using a suspension bridge. Now there's other things like an arch bridge. You've got something underneath it that's holding up that road surface. But with a suspension bridge, what you've got are two towers with cables between them and then hangers from that, and those hangers are holding up that road surface. It's sometimes called a hanging bridge rather than a suspension bridge. And that, you can see, it can be 100 feet all the way across. The problem is, the idea for suspension bridges has been around for quite a long time, for centuries really, but they've always been on a very small scale. Up to this point, the largest one that had been built was one up in Scotland a few years before. That was 259 feet long, but Telford had to cover 577 feet. So it was a huge challenge to be able to come up with a design that would, an untested design basically, that would be much bigger than anything else that had been done before. But Telford was the man to do it. He was a very ingenious engineer, civil engineer. You can see here that these chains, they go over the top of the tower and then they come down and the chains are actually anchored on the masonry on either side of the bridge. But he decided that wasn't going to be strong enough, that wouldn't be able to take enough weight. So he went back to the drawing board and came up with this idea instead. Instead of the chains being anchored down along here, he had the chains go all the way down here, start going underground. And they were anchored way underground here and quite a long ways away. If you know the area, that anchorage point is right underneath where the roundabout is by the Anglesey Arms. So those chains go quite a long way. And on the other side, it goes all the way over and it's anchored underneath where the railway runs. So this gives you, you put much more weight on the chains and much more weight on the surface and to carry a lot more vehicles and so on. And he was also able to, he didn't need as much masonry here, so he was able to just use a little bit of masonry, made it a much more elegant design. So it's a beautiful bridge from that point of view. So this was his final design, and then he had that approved, and then he went on to start planning the construction of it. So he and his chief engineer, William Provost, then walked the shorelines around bits of Anglesey looking for suitable stone that they could use within easy transport distance. And the one they chose was up at Penmon Point. There's Penmon Abbey here. And there's two quarries up there. There's the Flagstaff quarry here, and then the Dinmore quarry on the outside here. And he decided those are limestone quarries, and the very good limestone there. So he decided that would be the best place to get the stone from, and then you could just load it onto rafts there and float it down the Menai Strait to where the bridge was to actually start building the bridge. So they decided to start quarrying there, and then on the 10th of August 1819, they laid the very first stone that had been brought down to start building that first tower, the Anglesey side tower. And the first stone was on the far side of this tower, facing out onto the sea. And then they built up all these arches over the next 3 or 4 years. This shows you a little diagram of the work area. And you can see here there's the quays where they would bring the stones up there and unload them. And then there are these railway tracks that would bring the stones around to the various places that they needed to be at to start building the bridge. And there are various workshops and things like that around there too, and offices and so on. This is a plaque that Menai Heritage and the Institution of Civil Engineers erected on 2019 to mark the 200th anniversary of the starting of building the Menai Suspension Bridge. And the engraving on that shows the men lifting one of the blocks to put it into place. The chains were made out of wrought iron. And the basics of the chains are these here. These are these eye bars. We've got a couple of these in our exhibition in Menai Bridge at the Telford Center. And they are basic eye bars, and you would have a collection of 5 of these that would be bolted together to make a sturdy chain. Some of those would have these little spacers here where you could tighten the chain to, so once you get it into place, you can move those and tighten them so that the chains are just the right tension as needed be. Each one of those sections, then you'd have 4 of these sections on each one of the chains, and you can see here now that there's 4 chains as well. There's 2 on either side and 2 going down the middle. So you've got quite a large number of these iron bars going into making up those chains. Now, how did they build the chains? How did they get the chains in place in the first place? Well, this diagram shows how they did that. This is, on here it was all stonework here, so you could work out there, you could build scaffolding and then construct the chains right on top of the scaffolding from the places where they're anchored all the way up to the tops of the towers. But you had to get the chains across that gap somehow. So what they did was they built a raft and on the shore there of the Menai Strait, and built the chain on there and pieced it all together. And then when it was all ready, they would float that raft out between the 2 towers of the bridge, tie a rope onto the end of the chain, put the rope over the top there, and then you had these 2 capstans there that had 150 men in total pushing the arms of that to turn those capstans, to pull that rope to raise the chains. And they had a band there playing the fife and drums and everything to get them in time to go and push, 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 push. So they slowly got the chain up to the top of the tower on this side, and then got it up to the top of the tower on that side, pinned it together, put a pin in it to hold it together with the chains that are existing. And that first chain then was raised on the 26th of April, 1825. So those 150 men then were key to raising those chains. There's a man called Dr. Pring, who was chronicling what was going on with the building of the bridge, said at that point, said after that first chain was put up, Telford himself climbed up to the top of the tower to inspect the chain to make sure it looked proper, it looked like it was working fine and all that. And then 3 of the workers cheekily got up there too and walked out across the chains. One of them was William Williams, the laborer, one of them Hugh Davies, a stonemason, one was John Williams, a carpenter. I'm not sure what happened to them, but Pring said they had the temerity to pass along the upper surface of the chain. But he also points out that each one of those 150 men were regaled with a quart of kuru da, of good beer. So cheers to them. So the final chain was raised on 9th of July, 1825. So just a couple months to do that. So, and this is the finished product, the bridge. It was officially opened on the 30th of January in 1826, although there was still some work they needed to do. They hadn't finished adjusting the chains. They still needed to finish putting the railings in and so on. There wasn't really a ceremony to say, but in the middle of the night, William Provis, the chief engineer, basically hijacked a mail coach that was supposed to take a ferry at 1:30 a.m., but he and a couple of the other engineers stopped it on the road and diverted it to be the first vehicle to go over the bridge at 1:30 in the morning. Telford then came along and he crossed over later, and during the day crowds of up to 5,000 people gathered to look at the bridge and walk across it, even though it was the rain and gales during the day. The bridge, of course, it was a magnificent structure, the biggest suspension bridge that had ever been built at the time. It was world famous even while it was being built, and it was soon celebrated widely in art and prose and poetry. The poet laureate, Robert Southey, at the time, talks about Telford, who over the vale of Cambrian Dee, aloft in the air, a giddy height upborne, talking about the Pontcasilte aqueduct. And then he says he carried his navigable road and hung high over the Menai Straits, the Bendine Bridge. And another a bit of praise of the bridge was done by Anne Lister, who was a Yorkshire landowner and diarist, and of course the subject of the popular BBC program in 2019, Gentleman Jack. She had been touring around the North Wales in 1822, and she particularly came to visit the ladies of Clongauchlin, but was also looking around other sites around here. She knew about how famous this magnificent bridge was going to be, and so she came over to have a look at it. So she says, I got out at the bridge over the straits, of which the 4 small arches on the Anglesey side and the 3 on this side are finished. The span left for the iron arch looks tremendous, and the work completed will deserve a high place among the wonders of our land. In point of strength it is Egyptian, in point of lightness and it is in proportion it's Grecian. I am delighted with it, and I think it's so far the finest thing I ever saw. And of course it was also celebrated by Lewis Carroll too, who in Through the Looking Glass says, the White Knight says to Alice, I heard him then, for I had just completed my design, to keep the Menai Bridge from rust by boiling it in wine. Now, that's not strictly true, but there's a kernel of truth to that. He didn't boil it in wine, but what did happen was they soaked all the ironwork that was going to go into the chains in warm linseed oil to protect it from rust. Somehow that got turned into wine, but in the telling. And of course, the Menai Suspension Bridge has been the target, really subject of numerous paintings, postcards, and so on, even some of the more frivolous ones like you see here. So there must be hundreds of different designs of Menai Suspension Bridge postcards. So it's a very, very famous bridge. There are a lot of changes that happened during the early days of it. In 1826, just a week after the opening, another storm came along, and those railings were still not fixed in place, and the chains hadn't really been tightened up yet as much as they should have been. So in this storm caused a motion of these chains and caused a lot of damage to the actual road surface. So at that point they decided, well, we can maybe stop the chains from swaying so much by putting these braces across the chains, between the chains like that, and then they had to rebuild the road surface as well. This road surface was basically just wood planks that was put on top of iron rods that were hung from the suspension bridge there. In 1836, another storm came along, and the wind there caused severe undulation of the bridge. The bridge keeper, a man called Henry Fisher, reported the undulations were up to 16 feet, the bridge swaying up and down like this because of the wind. And there's the shrinkage of the wooden planks was basically the blame for that. So they had to put new flooring, new planks on the bridge and so on, to do more things to try to shore up the chains so that they wouldn't sway so much. In 1839, another storm came along in the middle of the night, and it really severely damaged the deck. It didn't just loosen things up a bit. Some bits of the deck actually fell out, so there were holes in the bridge. The bridge master, Henry Fisher again, he lived in the bridge house that was at the end of the bridge, and he came out and saw what was happening in the middle of the night. He could see there was a hole in the bridge, and he knew how dangerous that was, obviously. So he closed the gate, the toll gate on that end of the bridge, went down to the edge of the strait to get in a boat, had to row across in the storm to the other side, climb up onto the Anglesey side, and then go close the gate on the other side, which he did about 2 minutes before the mail coach arrived. And if he hadn't done that, the mail coach would have gone across like that. So he was very brave, very fortunate that he managed to do that. In 1893, there was more work done on the bridge. It was inspected by Sir Benjamin Baker, and he assessed the condition of the bridge. And he decided that stonework and the ironwork was still in very satisfactory condition, but the actual road deck was a concern. That was just basically planks on top of some steel rods. So there was a new material that had been produced by then. It was the corrugated metal that you see there. So he came up with designs to replace the wood with this corrugated iron instead. And then they would put concrete and asphalt layers on top of that later to make a much stronger surface on the deck. Then in 1908, some more work was done. The hangars, some of the hangars were replaced, and because they were corroded a bit when they were attached to the railings. When we get into the early 20th century, then the increasing vehicle size meant that a 4.5-ton limit had to be introduced on the bridge. The toll collectors had difficulties trying to enforce that. They couldn't really figure out how heavy something was going across. So in 1922, they installed a weigh bridge there, that rectangular surface there, so they could actually weigh all the vehicles to make sure that they weren't too heavy going across. In the Menai Heritage Museum, we have a book where people could write their memories. And one person several years ago left memories saying that his parents moved over at some point when that weigh bridge was in use. And they were moving all their worldly belongings from somewhere onto the island on Anglesey. But when they arrived, it was too heavy to go across. So they had to unload half of their worldly goods onto the roadside beside the Anglesey Arms, or the Adslope on the other side, and to take everything to the new house and then come back and collect the rest of their stuff to take it over. And these days too, any buses that went over, if they had too many passengers on, some of the passengers would have to get off and walk across and the bus would then drive over across empty. So after this was done, they decided to do some stress testing on the chains to make sure that the metalwork was still in good condition. So they put these measuring instruments on the chains here, and then they marshaled up a test convoy of various vehicles, all sorts of coal trucks and so forth there, and a few at a time, and then more and more. And as they sent more vehicles over, they were able to see whether the bridge could take that stress. And eventually they sent a whole convoy over with a farmer proudly leading his very fine bull at the head of the convoy. And those tests show that all the metalwork and everything was still very sound. We go further on into the 20th century, and we can see some maintenance going on here. Every time I put this up, everybody goes, oh, health and safety, because there wasn't much of it there. So you can see that they've got these plank walkways. They were hanging from braces off the chains there, so they could walk back and forth while they went back and forth and cleaned the rust off and painted the chains and all that. They had to replace a few of the eye bars in the chain, so you can see that going on over here. You can see the cars just going on, going past as they're doing that, hoping that the eye bar is not going to fall down on top of them. So it does look like a dangerous working conditions, and it was, because sadly during this work, there was a man called Hugh Thomas Owen, who was age 35, who died when he fell off the top of the tower there when he was working. During the inquest, several of his colleagues came along and they were questioned about their working conditions, and they said that wearing belts and harnesses while they were working at height really wasn't practical, because they needed to walk back and forth. They didn't need to move around too much, and they didn't want to chain themselves to any one position. So they basically, at that point, they continued working as they did, even despite the obvious dangers that were there. So in the next decade, the vehicles got increasingly heavier again, and plans were drawn up to reconstruct the bridge. Now, the original bridge, of course, had these 4 sets of chains made out of wrought iron, but those were basically reaching the limit of how much weight that they could carry. So they decided to instead, they would take those sets of 4 wrought iron chains off and put up 2 steel chains instead, 2 sets of steel chains, which would be much stronger. But they wanted to keep the road open too, so they had to do it piecemeal. So you can see here all the scaffolding that was set up. You can see the road decks still open one way anyways there. And on this side now, they've removed one of the chains here, and you can still see the other 3 there. So we go further on now. Here's you've got the 2 steel chains on either side here that have been installed, and so those are holding up the weight of the bridge there now, and they've started taking down the wrought iron chains in the middle. Back when you had the 2 chains down the middle of the bridge, any pedestrians going across would walk between those 2 chains down the middle of the road. But at this time, when they removed those, they couldn't do that anymore. So they had to construct walkways on the outside of the bridge where they are now. So they had to put these brackets out there and top them with steel plates and asphalt and so on to build the walkways around the outside, and then just have vehicular traffic on the middle there. So the reconstruction mainly finished by the end of 1940, and then a ceremony was held on 31st of December 1940 to officially release the bridge from the tolls. There had been a toll bridge up to then, and this is one of the last toll boards showing how much needed to be paid for each crossing. And this is in the Menai Bridge Museum now. We've also got in our collections the last 6pence that was paid as a toll going across the bridge, and that was paid by Sir Richard Williams Bulkeley of Baron Hill from Beaumaris. And also in our collections are the scissors that were used to actually cut the ribbon to open up the bridge at the time. They're inscribed to be to the Right Honorable J.T.C. Moore Brabazon, who was the Minister of Transport at the time, but he wasn't actually there. His representative came to cut the ribbon, and then he had to give the scissors back to his boss. So there's more recent work that's been going on since then. There's been painting, maintenance work, and all going on all through the decades, really. But there's been a lot of work being done on the bridge recently. Back in 1999, you see here, the bridge was closed completely because they wanted to strengthen the road surface again. It was closed for 12 weeks, and they took up the old concrete surface that was on the bridge, and they put in a new metal surface with these spikes on it, and then a very thin layer of concrete instead. It was much lighter, but still was much stronger. So that created a much lighter but stronger surface to strengthen the bridge. In 2005, they wanted to do a major repainting. Anytime they'd painted it before, they just added new paint onto the outside of the old paint. And so you had up to 32 layers of paint at some places on the old chains. So in 2005, they basically sandblasted everything back to the metal surface again. They had to do it on scaffolding, obviously, but also in an enclosed space because that old paint, of course, was full of lead, and they didn't want to get the environmental contamination around there. So it had to be done very carefully. It took quite a while to do it, but it took from February to December actually to do all that work and to remove all the chains, the paint, and repaint them. Then in 2021, a new program of repairs started. They had all sorts of different things planned, and the first thing they were going to do was replace the road surface, or the footpath surface that went around the outside of the bridge, and that went on into 2021. And then once that was finished, then they started looking at doing other work, like painting the metal work and inspecting the bridge to make sure that all the metal work was in good condition. Now these are the hangers here that hang from the chains down to actually hold up the road surface. Now when you're inspecting them, you can see the outside of everything. These are metal ropes, and these ropes basically go into these cone-like structures here, and then the ropes are sort of splayed out, and those cones are then filled with liquid zinc that holds everything in place. Now when you're inspecting them, you can look at the outside, is it corroded or whatever, but you can't see what's going on inside those cones. So after they finished doing the footpath surface, they took one of those hangers off and sent it off to be tested to see how strong that was. And they came back to say basically the metal inside those cones was far more brittle than anybody had imagined. And basically they came to the conclusion that if a heavy truck had been crossing the bridge and stopped in the middle of the bridge and one of those ropes broke inside those cones, the two next to them would break, the two next to them would break, and the whole bridge, just like a zipper, would just go, which is why they closed the bridge immediately. Yeah, it's quite a serious situation. So they had to come up with a plan fairly quickly to actually to get the bridge open and running again. So they came up with this fail-safe system here where they had these cables going over with tighteners on that and then going underneath here so that would hold up that section of the bridge. If one of those did break, that would still hold up the bridge. So they put these fail-safes all along the bridge then around those, and then they were able to open up the bridge, albeit with a weight limit brought in, as they then decided to do the plans for replacing those hangars. So once that was done, they had to figure out the work on the design for doing the hangars. Now all those hangars, as you can see on that side, they're all different lengths. So you can't just go buy hangars R Us or something like that. You know, you have to, each one has to be made individually, the exact length. It has to be very, very precise length, and so on. It has to be made out of good quality steel. So they've basically had a specialist Swiss steel manufacturer called Vatzer AG actually do the manufacturing. So all the designs were drawn up, each hanger was designed and so on, and then and the new sockets were designed as well for replacing those. Then they had to take down one by one the old hangers and put the new ones in. So they brought in this hydraulic press that they needed to use to pop out the pin that was holding the hanger onto that eye hole there. Apparently this is a very strong hydraulic press. It makes it, as it pops out that pin there, according to the people who work there, it makes a very almighty bang, a very satisfying bang as they pop them out. So they would take that out and then put the new ones in. So this shows you one of the old hangars there, and this is one of the new ones in place. So this work was finished then in November 2024, and there were 208 of these hangars all told they were replaced, and then they've gone through then and repainted all those hangars now. So now that we're going on to work on to do the work that they were planning on doing when they finished the footpath 2 years ago. So after taking care of all that, now what they needed to do, they needed to repair these corbels that were underneath the footpath there, these concrete corbels. You may see, they're working on that now, you may see them if you go over the bridge, a crane there, and there's some men dangling off of those on ropes to work on that there. And then the next thing they need to do is inspect and do painting underneath the bridge. And to do that, the Spencer's group, or their group who are doing all this work, have basically developed this aero truss system, which is basically a scaffolding that hangs off the bottom of the bridge. It's very lightweight, it's very aerodynamic, and this thing can shuttle back and forth, bringing everything going back and forth. This is a mock-up of what it's going to look like. It's all been constructed, and it's actually sitting on the dockside at Porth Penryn at the moment. And once they're ready to get started on this phase of the work, they're going to float it out onto the Menai Strait and lift that into place. And finally, when they get all that done, they're going to be upgrading the lighting system to a new LED light system, so they can have all sorts of fancy lights, different colors and things like that on the bridge. So, but it's still got a ways to go with all the delays and everything like that before they're currently saying it'll be next spring before everything's completely finished. So with all these delays, closures, and everything combined with the heavy traffic and the regular speed restrictions on the Britannia Bridge, there of course have been lots of calls for building a third crossing, a third bridge across the Menai Strait, as you can see here with a selection of some of the more recent ones from Nation Cymru. Back in 2017, there was the Welsh government had a consultation process of looking at ideas for building a third crossing. Over here are some of the ideas that they put forward in the consultation, different routes that could take place. This is where the Britannia Bridge goes across now. The one idea was put a red route on the other side of the Britannia Bridge between it and the high tension wires, one on the other side of the bridge, or one that goes straight across here, the purple route. And at the end of the consultation process, they decided that this purple route, the one going straight across, was going to be the best bet for building a new bridge. And they also looked at different designs of bridges. You had things like this, a cable stay bridge, which has large towers. It's sort of like a suspension bridge, but you've got cables that come down here individually to hold up the surface rather than just one chain. That's got very tall towers. You've got Extrados bridge, which has shorter towers, but then has these big box girder structures that strengthens the road surface. So you've got that holding it up as well as the chains holding it up. Or they have an idea of just building a cantilever bridge, which this has several more towers in the middle here to hold up the structure, but it's also got these box girder structures to strengthen it. And they also looked at ideas of either having 2 lanes of traffic or 4 lanes of traffic on the new bridge. With 2 lanes of traffic, you would have 2 lanes going one direction and 2 lanes coming back the other way on the Britannia Bridge. And then you'd also have pedestrian and cycleways on the other side. Or you could build a 4-lane bridge that would have two lanes going each way, and then the Britannia Bridge would be relegated to half of it being a cycle and pedestrian lane, and the other half being just a low-speed local road for just going one way across the strait. So these are all the different ideas, and the consultation at the end of that basically came up with that the cantilever bridge would be best, because these right next to the Britannia Bridge would basically hide that magnificent structure of the Britannia Bridge. There was another idea that came up, was put forward at the time too by the civil engineer Benji Poulton, and that's called Pont Bendigeidfran. And this is the bridge basically held up by a statue of the Welsh mythical king and the giant Bendigeidfran, Bran the Blessed. Of course, during this battle with the Irish armies, Bran laid down across the River Shannon to allow his troops crossing, and he said a man who would lead his people must first become a bridge. So it seems like the obvious person to immortalize in this bridge like this. The Welsh government did sort of entertain the idea for a while, but I doubt if that's going to go anywhere. But he was a civil engineer, so he did all the designs and everything. It would have worked, but just paying for it probably would be another problem. So anyways, in 2022, there was a review of roadworks all across Wales, and that recommended scrapping many of the roadworks that were being planned across Wales and improvements, and mainly to meet climate and environmental targets, and instead focusing on sustainable travel initiatives. So amongst many of the other roadworks that were canceled at the time was the third crossing. They said basically the third crossing wasn't going to happen. None of these things were going to happen. But since then, there's still been lots of calls for it to be resurrected every time there's problems on the bridges and all that, or at least to have some sort of other solution pursued. The Welsh government's backtracked a bit now. They're sometimes saying there's a possibility of building it. This is a written statement about Menai resilience, a study from just back in November. And that concluded, while we have not ruled out a third crossing in the future, we believe more can be done in the short to medium term to improve the resilience of the Britannia Bridge and the connections between Ynysmon and the mainland. But it did say these are the other ideas to improve the resilience they have here. Wind deflectors on the Britannia Bridge. You often have to go slow speeds on there because of the winds, but if you could put some sort of wind deflector beside it, that would reduce the need to do that. Changing the highway alignment and the traffic and speed management to make the traffic flow more properly across the bridge more evenly. A 3-lane tidal flow system. There's one lane each way now, but it's wide enough. You could have 2 lanes as long as you have some way of putting a barrier through it. And if you could do a tidal system where there's 2 lanes going off the island in the morning and 2 lanes coming on the island in the afternoon, then that would give you a lot more capacity. There are some ideas about making these movable concrete barriers that have been used elsewhere in the world, where when somebody pushes a button and all these barriers move over, and so you can change the lanes automatically and still have that good barrier between the lanes. And then, of course, bringing in bus priority measures too, to bus lanes and so on, to reduce the amount of traffic. But all of these are things that have been talked about since at least 2001, 25 years ago. How much longer are they going to keep talking about this? So anyways, despite all the problems we've had over the years, the bridges across the Menai Strait, both the suspension bridge and Britannia Bridge, are beautiful structures, are well-loved structures and all that. And of course, this year we're celebrating the bicentenary of the opening of the Menai Suspension Bridge in 1826. You can look forward to a full program of events. It kicked off in 31st of January on Bangor University History Day, where several talks were given about the bridge, including one that I gave about the reconstruction in the 1930s. And then there's a group that's putting together a big plan of other things that are going to be going on to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the bridge. And most of those events are going to be happening on the 8th of August, 2026. So put that in your diary and follow this Facebook page here that will have the listing. They should be hopefully releasing a program of what's going to be happening fairly soon, but they're going to have all sorts. They're going to have fair, they're going to have parade across the bridge, old vehicles and things like that. Lots of other things are going to be going on. So, and like I said, I've got copies of Bob's book here if you want to find out more about the Menai Suspension Bridge. And I've also got copies of my other books too if you're interested. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for a very, very thorough explanation of what's gone on and all that maintenance work, never-ending maintenance work. So let's throw it open to any questions that people might have. There's one right at the back between the 2 electronic boards. Can we just wait for the microphone, because then we'll all be able to hear you. It's on the way. There we are.
But the pillars, are they hollow or solid?
They are hollow, yes. There's like 2 hollow spaces in, so it's basically a rectangular structure, and then there's a sort of a wall, or whatever you want to call it, in the middle, but they are hollow, so it's not completely solid stone.
Why did they build them hollow rather than solid?
Used less stone, but it was still just as strong as filling them up. So it's like those pictures I was showing of the cross sections of the bridge where you had these box girders. Having a hollow box is often much stronger than having something just solid. So.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? There's one right at the front, just to get the microphone moving. There we are.
Need to get the steps up.
Yep.
Excellent. Great, Warren.
was very illuminating. Is there more you can say about the actual process that Telford went through in relation to Parliament, in bidding for the bridge? Well, not so much bidding. Once he had been nominated as the person to build it, what were the processes? Who was monitoring him? I mean, there weren't government departments at the time, so was it select committees of Parliament? And
It was very.
Just flesh that out.
Yeah, it was very much a select committees within Parliament. So you would have, Telford would come up with his plans, he would produce his report, send it off to Westminster, and then there were regular, I'm not sure how many, we've got most of the reports in our collections in the Menai Heritage Museum of the transcripts of these committee meetings where they were basically, Telford and his engineers would be called in, and they would be quizzed about, the select committee members, including several Irish Parliament members. At the time would have been quizzing them about things, about asking them, how is this going to work? Why are you doing it this way rather than that way, and so on. So it went under several rounds of inspection and querying by Parliament.
Yeah, that's at the national level, and then at the local level you had Carnarvon merchants, you're saying, and the Admiralty putting its view in, and then people in Balmoral. So what sort of politics was going on there?
I think that some of those early ideas were probably more things that were going to be built locally rather than a major national scheme like this was, because this was a national major infrastructure scheme.
But on the route, you were saying there was quite a lot of argument going on about the route.
That was, the earlier on, when they were just talking about just building a bridge across the strait. But since this was talking about completely rebuilding the A5 across North Wales and also the road from Chester and then also across Anglesey. So it was a major route, so that was going through Parliament and needing a parliamentary approval and approval of funds, of course. I'm not sure, these early ideas, I'm not sure where the funding would have come from those, but it was a much smaller scale project.
And there was a proposal, wasn't it, to move Holyhead or to move the railway anyway to Clean Peninsula, wasn't it, as the route to Ireland. So with that all came after the construction?
No, that was well before it. So that was, so there was, when, particularly when the railways were coming along, that was, no, that would have been, no, it would have been later actually. It would have been around the mid-1800s. So so there was Porth Incline. We're trying to get their port used as the endpoint for the railways, and Holyhead being already the packet port, said, oh, it should be here, and so there's a lot of back and forth about that too. But they eventually lost out, fortunately, because that's a lovely place.
Any more questions? Yes, one right at the front here, and then there's one.
Is that okay? You mentioned the cost, and that was presumably as a national infrastructure project that wasn't dependent on local funding. What about the ongoing maintenance and the recent maintenance? Because this is an enormous maintenance bill if it's paid locally. Is there a national component to that?
Yeah, ultimately it's a Welsh government now that's in charge of it with devolution, and then they've got this. The bridges are under one of these finance schemes that were set up, several years ago, so that the bridges and the A55 across Anglesey were built by a private company, and then they would be paid over the 30 years or so, the A55 highways they're called. And so they're under this private finance initiative type thing, and so that the Welsh government pays them a nominal amount for however much they think that is needed and how much use the bridges get and so on. So that's where the funding for all that comes from. Yeah.
Yes, there's one in the middle there. Yeah.
I listened with interest to all the problems they had with materials and maintenance and corrosion and so forth. Does it not strike you as hazardous to bury an essential cable in the ground where you can't regularly inspect it? And was this cable replaced with a steel one when the other cable
It was, yeah. So they had to go all the way down those tunnels to replace the old steel chains, or the old iron ones with the steel chains too. So yeah.
And
So-
was there a similar cable on the Anglesey side?
There is, yeah. So on the Anglesey side, it would have gone all the way down, and it would be underneath the roundabout, just up on the approach to the bridge. And on the other side, it goes through the top of the bridge house there, and then goes underground up into the hill where the railway rail track is. So they go
And
quite a
can
long
they
way.
keep an eye on this?
They initially did have a doorway into the side, so they could get in there to inspect it, but I think all that's been sealed off now, so I'm not sure what they've done with the steelwork in there. So I think they can go in there if they need to, but it's not regularly
The
inspected.
chain's
I
in a
don't think.
tunnel.
It is, yeah. So if you walk across the bridge, you can see the chains coming down, and then it goes. It's got this sort of saddle there where the chains connect up to these metal plates. The ones that are underground are actually metal plates rather than chains
I
like
see.
the other ones.
Oh, right.
So I think they're much stronger, less likely to corrode and all that. So yeah.
That's reassuring.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is really. I agree. I think there's one. Yes, there were.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. Nice to hear somebody actually getting Menai straight, correct?
I'm very particular about that.
Yes. Me too. Yes, I was going to answer about the PFI because that's a very extraordinary thing with the business of the maintenance and the design and the
Just been a
construction.
bit closer so we can all hear you. Yep.
Design and construction of the A55, which of course in a lot of places doesn't comply with Department of Transport regulations, which is why there are so many standing water areas which cause accidents, or shall we say incidents, because they're not really accidents. The other point I just wanted to clarify was one of the reasons for the thoughts about using the Fleam Peninsula as the end of the railway line was the demands of the slate industry rather than the parliamentary and travel to Dublin. But of course, Holyhead is very easy from the point of view of sailing to and from, because it's pretty much at the same east-west direction. It's a very straightforward sail. One other point, of course, is any bridges that would be built now, we would hopefully ensure that we still have the mast height to get under the bridge, because it always appears to me when I sail under there that my mast is very close to the parapet.
Right.
Can you just hold the mic a minute? What was your first point about the PFI?
The PFI,
Yep.
yes. Not many people realise, but the A55 is a special road. It's not a motorway. It's not a trunk road. It's a special road, and it has different regulations, which is why on various areas of the A55 you see signs for 70 miles an hour, which you never
Yes,
see
that's right.
anywhere else. And it's the PFI basically allowed the contracting company to build it to their own specification.
I see. And so you're saying that's why it's not up to standard, actually.
That's correct. And some of the slip roads, well, let me put that correctly, the acceleration and deceleration splays do not comply with standard 70-mile-an-hour roads, which is why areas like Colwyn Bay are reduced to 50, and there are several junctions, I think it's junction 12, is it, or something, that are very short, and that, basically, they're non-compliant.
So it's very, very interesting. Well, just one thought about it. Are you saying that the accident rate on this road is higher than the national average because of this financing arrangement?
I couldn't guarantee that, but I have raised on several occasions with our MS, and I did try and get the Minister for Transport to come and talk to us about the standing water on the A55. If you look at the number of areas of the Central Reserve that get damaged, and you look where they are, they tend to be immediately after where standing water occurs on the carriageway.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So, was there another hand up? I think there was, yes, Gus. Yes.
Thank you, Warren. I'm just wondering whether any other aircraft have been flown under the bridge, apart from the one by a Ross Snyder, former pub landlord.
I've heard stories about others being flown underneath there. One that did actually happen was an airship that flew under the Menai Suspension Bridge. At the end of the First World War, there's Tommy Elmhurst, who was one of the airship captains at where Mona Field is now, Mona Airfield is now. And so there were airships that were there that were used over the Irish Sea. And when they were celebrating the end of the Simon Armistice, he made a bet with one of the other officers that he would be able to fly his airship underneath it. The other officer said, "I bet you £5 or whatever, you can't fly your airship underneath that bridge." And he says, "I'll take that bet, but you have to come with me." So what he had to do was basically, he knew how high his airship was, of course, but he wasn't quite sure how high the bridge would be. He knows how high it was supposed to have been, but he wanted to make sure. So what he did is he went to the suspension bridge with a long rope and a weight on the end of it, dropped it off to measure how high it would be at high tide, and then he took that, so he got how long that rope was. He subtracted the height of his airship and then divided it in two. And then he tied a rope onto the bottom of the carriage of the airship that was half that length. And so with a sandbag on the end, when that sandbag hit the water surface, he knew he was flying straight down the middle. He had the same amount above and below. And there is actually a photograph of it going through. So that one has, definitely been proven.
Yes, there's one question right at the front here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really fascinating talk. The third crossing, do you think there's a possibility that will raise its head again if Wilver goes ahead? I mean, they say that Wilver's going ahead anyway, but we've heard that so many times, and nothing seems to be moving very much at the moment.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons why it sort of dropped down the agenda, is because there wasn't as much traffic that would be expected to be coming across for building Wolva and all that. And also after Brexit too, there was, is there going to be less traffic going to Holyhead as well? So you've got less traffic going across, but you've got two issues really with the third crossing. You've got, in the mornings you have to wait 5 minutes to get across because there's a lot of queues, and sometimes it's a bit worse than that, particularly when the ferry traffic's coming along. But it's not too bad. But the worst thing is resilience. And if the suspension bridge is closed for some reason or down to one lane, and then an accident happens on the Britannia Bridge, you're stuffed. And when they were doing that first back in 1999, when the bridge was closed for 12 weeks for completely replacing the road surface, there was one time when we were driving into Bangor. And there was an accident on the Britannia Bridge, and I was stuck outside of Pentraeth Auto for several hours because it just went to gridlock. So that kind of resilience is why having a third crossing is useful. So, but again, if they keep talking about these ideas of how they can improve the traffic going across and improve the resilience of it and all that, but those still won't take into account situations like that. So, but whether they can come up with the money or not is another story.
There's one more just right next door. Yep.
Hello. I rather like the idea of the statue supporting the bridge. I thought it'd be a really good tourist attraction.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, they didn't look at it, but there was a proposal for pylons being made looking like men's.
Oh, yeah.
And again, it was all properly designed, so it could have been done practically, but of course, people poo-poo the idea.
Oh, yeah.
But again, a lovely, different and a tourist attraction.
Certainly it would be, yeah. I'd love seeing something like that. So,
Yeah, much better than boring old ordinary pylons.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My understanding was that the engineering involved in this was very, very pioneering. Was it road tested at all at Iron Bridge beforehand, which was a Telford bridge, if I'm right? And was he sort of road testing this crossing?
More of the road testing was happening over in Conway, because at the same time he was building the Conway Bridge as well, and using similar ideas there. Didn't have nearly as much distance to go, but yeah, he was working on both of them at the same time, so he was able to try things out there. They started working on the Conway Bridge a bit longer after the Menai Bridge, but I think they finished it beforehand, if I remember right. But yeah, they've all the steel work and everything like that. That was done in Hazeldine's steel works over near Shrewsbury, I think it is, and they had all sorts of testing equipment up there too. So they were able to, manufacture one of these wrought iron chains and then put it in machines that would stretch it to see how much stress it could take, and then use that to calculate how much it would carry and so on. So they were doing a lot of that, but on the smaller scale at Conway, he was working out ideas there too.
Right, just one more here. Yep.
Thank you. Great talk. You mentioned a Scottish bridge. Was it the Erskine Bridge over the Clyde?
No. What was the name of that one? Can't remember at the moment.
Get to it afterwards. Maybe.
Yeah. Okay. I'll get to that afterwards. But yeah, that was yeah.
So there's the one behind, is it? Oh yeah, I can't see. Okay. There we are. Thank you very much.
Yeah. It was Dryborough Abbey Bridge. That was it. That was in 1817. That was built. Dryborough Abbey, in the Borders.
Yep.
Okay, diolch yn fawr. Well, where did all the staff come from? It's major in construction. And you mentioned 150 men turning that big wheel. Where did all the staff come from? They weren't local, I don't think.
A lot of them came from elsewhere. We don't really have the employment records or anything, unfortunately, for them. You can get some ideas by looking at the censuses from around the time, but to know whether, so you can see people from elsewhere who had come here, but at least around even the censuses, that was before the censuses, so you didn't even have that data. So unfortunately, we don't really know too much about where these people came from.
How easy would it be to destroy the bridge? Now, the reason I'm asking this question, during the war, when Liverpool was being heavily bombed, the ammunition ships and the explosive ships were diverted to Holyhead. And my father, in fact, was involved in unloading them and getting them onto the mainland. And one of his concerns was, of course, whether the bridges would be attacked by the Germans. Now, that is the basis of my question. How difficult was it for them? Because they never, as far as I know, ever made any attempt whatever to attack those bridges. They attacked Liverpool, but not the way in which the explosives were coming into Europe from the States.
Right, yeah.
And as an aside, I did get off a bus to walk across their Menai suspension bridge many years ago.
So now they did during the war, they did actually have soldiers stationed at both bridges, at both ends of the bridges, to prevent saboteurs, not only maybe German agents, but also particularly during the First World War, any Irish would come over, because that was at the time of the Easter Rising. And so they were guarded, but that wouldn't stop planes or anything like that, and if anybody wanted to try to bomb the bridge, but they were protected from sabotage anyways.
I think the bridge would have been out of the range, wouldn't it? Liverpool was at the edge of the range, isn't that right? Of the German bombers. Any more questions? If there aren't, I just was going to take advantage of you being here with your amazing knowledge of Anglesey history. Just before we sort of close, there have been a couple of big digs recently. I think people would be interested to know what's happening archaeologically on the island. What's been happening recently?
Yeah, well, one of the main thing that's going to be coming up is over at Oriel Mon. They're going to be having a exhibition of treasures, of things that have been recently found on Anglesey. In particular, there's been some new digs recently that have actually featured on some of the TV programs out near Clyncarrigbach. Now, you know, Clyncarrigbach is a site where during the Second World War, a lot of Iron Age, Romano, British, around that time, treasures have been found, gold, remnants of chariots, spears and swords and things like that, most of which are all down in Cardiff at the St. Fagans Museum. These were found when they were extending the airfield out at Valley. And so it's a very famous collection of artifacts. And there's recently been some more digs there where they found some new, quite interesting things from that same era. And so those are going to be going on display at Oriel Mon during the summer. I think I can't remember the exact dates when it's going to be up, but it's called Treasure. And those new items that have been found there are actually going into the Oriel Mon collections, I understand. So, but there have been other things that, one thing in particular, some of these are older major digs that have happened on Anglesey, but have been well documented now. There was in Park Cubby where the Premier Inn and all the truck car parks and everything like that were at. They were a huge archaeological dig that was done there when they were developing that site. And and that was they found sites from Mesolithic, Neolithic, medieval, sort of throughout the whole Anglesey history, and that's all been relatively recently published in a full volume, telling you all about what's going on with that. There was several years ago a talk. Or a conference that was held to talk about all the artifacts that were found there. And here at the Park Cubby, we basically had acres and acres that was stripped bare, and the archaeologists, because there's work everywhere, and just find all these wonderful things around there. And at the convention or the conference, somebody asked a question at the end saying, if you were to do the same thing elsewhere on Anglesey, would you find the same amount of treasures? And they said, yep. So basically, if anywhere underneath you, there are treasures of Anglesey. It's just finding, the places to, the ability to find it. There was also recently near Clanbedrigach, near Red Dwarf Bay, there's been excavations that have been going on there for several years. And that's found Mesolithic, Neolithic, and Viking era treasures there and evidence and all that, including skeletons that seem to have possibly been from Scandinavians. And all that's just recently been published, just a couple days ago. I pre-ordered the book to cover this almost a year ago, and it's finally finished. I had no idea exactly what was going to be in the book. I just said I'd have to have this. And about a week or two ago, this package this thick landed on my on my doorstep. So it's this book. It hurts my legs if I hold it on my lap trying to read it, So, but there's a huge thing of archaeological evidence there, and it goes into great details about how the archaeologists work and what they found and so on. So there's all sorts of interesting things that have come out of Anglesey.
Lots going on. Any other questions before we close? Just in that case, thank you very much indeed for both a very thorough talk on the bridge and that last interesting bit about what's been happening in the digs on Anglesey. So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah. Thank you.